Before I get into this episode, I wanted to plug Metro Podcasts. If you head to the show notes, you will see more about where I filmed all of the episodes in New York City and how to get in touch with the studio to host your own or book your own studio space. So I have an incredible guest in the studio today, and she is actually the team and the person behind the studio, which is why she's amazing. Ginny Saraswati, she is the founder of Ginny Media Company.
Yes.
Ginny Media Company. The podcast that she has, she's interviewed people like Paula Abdul, Ruby Rose, Cynthia Rowley, some of my absolute favorite people. But her background in media and podcasting is so unique. You know, I've interviewed other podcasters on this show, but I've never in particular interviewed someone who is a host, but also has done so much work with companies, so knows the branding side of podcasts and what sets them apart. So definitely going to dig into that on this episode. So I would love, Ginny, for you to start off. You're originally from Sri Lanka, then you were Australia, now New York. So tell me the story.
Well, I didn't have a say in moving to Australia, Alexa. So yes, I was born in Sri Lanka, moved to Australia when I was 2, and then pretty much I grew up a very shy girl. Because, you know, when you grow up in a new town, nobody looks like you. Mm-hmm. So you kind of feel like, ooh, I'm standing out here like a deer in headlights. So I was a little bit shy, a little bit reserved. And then, like, you know, fast forward to almost 20 years later, I found podcasting, or radio, should I say. And I had my own radio show for 10 years on and off. And then as a consequence of being a radio host, you get made into a podcaster. So here we are. 15 years later, I'm in New York. Didn't think I'd end up here, but that is the elevator pitch of my bio.
I know. I used to live here back when I was like 16, and it's so different being an adult in New York than like being the broke starving artist. That's a whole other story. But why podcasting? I mean, you have like a media empire, but podcasting in particular seems like something you're very intrigued by.
Absolutely. I find it so fascinating as a medium, podcasting, because you think about radio, that was my background, right? The intimacy of the medium, you're literally in someone's ear. So to be able to form that connection with someone, that impact, and even you can just talk about anything and feel like you're a part of the conversation. I think that's something that's overlooked in podcasting. People are like, let's go scale, let's go mass, let's do YouTube, let's do this, but go back to the roots of radio. It's a very intimate platform. People who listen to radio and podcasts, they do it by themselves. It's not this, hey, let's get a Netflix show on and binge together. It's very intimate. And that's why I think it's so powerful.
Also, FYI for anyone listening, I used to have a Radio Disney show called Fearless Every Day. So radio is very much, I know it's not as cool as it used to be, but like it's a thing.
100%. Radio, I mean, I think now podcasting is the new radio because now it gives listeners and audiences autonomy as to when they can listen. But again, it's the grandfather of podcasting when you think about it. So that intimacy factor is still carried on to podcasting and audio media, really.
If someone asks you nowadays, and I'm assuming you get this question a lot, should I start a podcast? What's your advice?
Absolutely. I think people ask, oh yeah, you know, every man and their dog seems to be doing a podcast. And the truth is, if you look at the 3 mediums, so you've got blogging, you've got vlogging, and you've got audio media, right? There's like over 600 million blogs, 37 million YouTube channels, and only, 5 million podcasts? So if you look at it from that lens, podcasting is still very much in its infancy stages, if you look at it that way. So the best time to start a podcast actually is now.
I also am really fascinated by podcasting because number one, people go into it thinking that they're going to make it into some huge thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's my biggest frustration. I don't know if you can relate, but it seems like you've been in media almost as long as I've been. Like I started my blog back in 2011, so TikTok wasn't a thing.
Exactly.
Podcasting also was not a thing back then, so you really had to build a brand. And podcasting is a long game. Like you're 100%. Not going to get instant fame or success from a podcast, nor should you ever enter anything with that expectation.
100%. And I think that's what now podcasting has hit the wave of, because you see Joe Rogan, Meghan Markle, Barack Obama handed these multi-million-dollar contracts. You're like, hey, that's going to be me. But you've got to go back to the why of why you're starting a podcast, right? So it could be because you want to build relationships with guests. You want to get lead generation for your business. Or it could be because you want to speak to some pretty interesting people and see where that takes you. So going back to that is where like the focus should be, on making good content, and then the money will come in its ways.
And that's for anything, right? Like
exactly.
Anything entrepreneurial. As you've embarked on also helping other companies with podcasts, What are some of the companies you've helped work on? And some Fortune 500 companies, I think.
Yep, absolutely. So last year we worked with the Skim on this.
Skim.
Skim's great. I mean, I don't need to rev about Skim. We all love Skim. But I think the great thing about Skim is they teamed up with Whirlpool, and Whirlpool were doing this initiative across America called the Care Counts program, where they were providing washers and dryers to schools across America because they wanted to tackle the issue of absenteeism. Because one of the reasons why there was chronic absenteeism at schools was because kids did not have access to clean clothes. So if you look at it that way, I'm like, wow, that's really cool that you're helping kids, not only affecting their future. Because if you think about kids' formative years, right? If you miss school from ages 6 to 12, that's your formative years of education, right? But if you have access to clean clothes, that will help you go to school and feel confident and comfortable in school. I mean, that is a great story in and of itself. So I think what I really liked about that was, one, I didn't know that was happening. So for me, it was like, oh, this is really cool. And secondly, I didn't know how much of an issue absenteeism was, and that was a contributing factor. So brands that can educate and impact and also make a difference in communities and raise awareness around that, I think those are the brands that actually go further and connect with audiences.
What do you think, and the Skim is actually a good example of this, what do you think has made the Skim such a long-term it's been in the space for a while. The Skim, Betches, Pop Sugar, why those?
I think they keep innovating to what's actually happening with audience. They evolve with what audiences want. So let's take audio media, for example. So the Skim have Skim This, and they have, is it 9 to 5, I think it's called? They have another podcast stream, but Skim This is where they put a lot of their branded content on. So they keep up and they create content, branded content, for example, according to what the brands are working on. So they do it and deliver it in a way to what audiences are actually going to. So if the audiences are going to TikTok, let's do something in TikTok. So I think that's what makes Skim, and Betches too. I mean, they know how to cater to that particular platform to where their audience is growing and evolving. They're not sticking to this particular demographic because, with a brand, once their audiences age out or die, let's just be blunt here, how are they going to get new customers in? Yeah. So you've got to keep evolving to where audiences go to. And I think businesses and brands who stop from doing that, they're going to find themselves in trouble very quickly.
A lot of people ask me that too, coming from the personal brand side of things. Sure. Is like, how do you grow with your audience and whatnot? And I definitely think there's something to be said about building a brand with, say, a podcast and the social media that has legs to evolve. Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, I personally started this when I was 12. How old were you when you got into media in general?
19.
Yes, so young, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So we're older now. Yeah. And so what have you found to be the sweet spot of like how you've evolved with the fan base that you have, and especially with starting the podcast?
Yeah, I try not to be romantic with anything. It's a very Gary Vee thing to say, but like it's the truth, because I think I love radio. I think it's obviously I have an attachment to it because that's where I started, and you probably do too. But radio was the thing back then when I was 19 that got me into media. That's what people were going to. That's what audiences were flocking to. But I think for me, again, the mentality of what I mentioned about the Skim, it's just like, okay, at the time I remember when I started radio, YouTube just came out, right? And Google bought YouTube. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. For Google to buy this platform, clearly there's some attention to it. That's what they want, right? And then YouTube videos came out, and now channels, and people have just kind of bounced off there. So I think it's just evolving with where the audience goes. So you take your audience with you, they'll come with you, your followers, but also new audiences, right? Because you want to keep growing and keep providing good content to new audiences as well.
So what you did with the Skim, was that a seasonal kind of show?
That was a seasonal. That was a 3-episode special. And then like other podcasts that I work with, like Siemens, for example, The Future Car, or there's other podcasts called Innovation in the Classroom. It's catered towards a specific audience. It's very niche. But those podcasts are more ongoing than like a series like The Skim.
I tried a seasonal podcast when I was doing another show, and I liked it because it gave me more flexibility. I felt like, once you do the 10, then you're done. But would you say that the best podcasts are the ones that consistently put out content every week?
I think good content is good content, regardless of whether it's seasonal or episodic in your case. I understand why people go the serial route, because it's easy. You can focus on, okay, there are 12 great episodes I'm going to put out at this particular amount of time. But I think at the end of the day, consistency, whether it be in that serial or consistency, whether it be episodic, that's the key.
Yeah.
Because like the worst thing is telling your audience, hey, I'm going to release an episode weekly, and then you miss a week or two. That's the part where it's like, oh God. what's happening.
I find it so intriguing too, because I talk to so many young people, especially these conferences, and you know, anytime you put anything out there, you're gonna like no one's gonna see it. I mean, like literally, I mean, like no one's gonna see it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people are like, I don't want to do it because I'm just scared, or no one's gonna see it. And I'm like, what is the proper way to address that? Because when I think back of what I was doing, I mean, I didn't start a blog because I wanted it to be anything. There was no. I didn't care about anyone seeing it. But now, because people know what can come of it, there's this obsession with like, if it doesn't have eyes, it doesn't have legs.
That's actually a really great
That's a
way.
great quote.
Yeah, I know. I was like, if it doesn't have eyes, it doesn't have legs.
I feel like I should write that down.
You should get a note for
No,
that.
I'm not even
You write it
keep
down.
talking, but I'm literally writing this down.
That's a great one. I think there's always going to be some form of imposter syndrome that shows up when you're about to start a project where you have to be seen or heard in a public way, potentially, right? So I think that is one fragment of that too. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, okay, I'm scared how it's going to look. I'm scared how it's going to sound. Like, think of the staircase mentality. That is a one step to get you to the top of the staircase. So I would say, like, as simple as this sounds, just break it down. Yes, people will see it. People will listen to it. Yes, it'll be nerve-wracking, but at the other end of it, there could be some amazing opportunity here.
Yeah, I also think what you said earlier about how you view the podcast.
Yeah.
When I was starting the podcast, I mean, I didn't have any. My mindset was never to kind of use it as networking, but I have realized so much the power of how, I mean, and I started this consulting business, which is part of the reason I wanted to expand to the UK. Podcasting is a really great way to get in the door with like celebrities, with people, because everyone wants to talk about themselves. It's kind of like a domino effect, and you never know what will come with it. But you've had some incredible guests on your show. So how do you go about determining the content?
So the one thing that when I was in radio, this is a training that we were given when I went to like radio school for 6 months. At that radio station, they were like, so these guests typically, like say someone like an A-list celebrity, typically they're coming on your radio show because they're promoting something. So it's a book, a film, like a TV show. And they're like, what can you do? Yes, they're going to do that obviously at some point in the interview. You know that's expected. But they're trained to answer questions based on the press release their publicist has sent, right? So it's like, okay, this is what you can talk about, this is what you say. But how can you kind of disrupt that mentality a little bit? So I remember with Paula Abdul, when she came in, I'm like, okay, how can we disrupt her and kind of make her giggle a little bit? So what we did was we took her whole back catalogue of songs, like everything from Rush Rush to Hoedown and what was it? Opposites Attract.
Okay.
I'm like trying to think and we like made a conversation with all those like songs in there between the two of me and my co-host, and that was the introduction. So she was sitting there expecting us to be like, welcome to Rise Up, Paula Abdul, like a very stock standard intro. But we did that, and she was like, you could just see her face just changed, and you could just see she just relaxed.
Yeah.
And we could talk about different things. So I think, disrupting them, just kind of, my goal always in an interview is to bring out the human in someone, because there is something we can connect on, whether it be food or the love for our mothers. Like there's something, regardless of our religious beliefs or what political beliefs, there's something we can connect on. So my goal is to get there. And how can we get there the quickest in the 40 minutes that we've got with them?
You're, as the podcast host, and I bet you can relate to this because I used to get a lot, I still get, tons of inbound inquiries, but I'm very strategic now. Yeah. And the reason I'm strategic is because I've interviewed people who have cold pitched me, and it is the worst fucking interview. The person is a narcissist, and like halfway through, I'm just like, oh my, like, I don't care. Why are other people going to care? Did I just waste an hour? So as a podcaster, and especially when you're starting, how can you figure out exactly how to interview people, what the way to properly host, and handle a conversation is if you're not really a people person?
That's a great question. Here's the thing, right? With those pitches, those cold pitches, I've gotten a few too. I find they give like 15-minute answers. Who can listen for 15 minutes to one person's answer? That's a lot.
Please.
Yeah,
I know.
Like
I know.
No.
I know,
like,
honey, I know.
So if this is painful for the person you're spending time with, imagine how painful it is to the people who listen. But at least they have the option of switching over, right?
I know.
We kind of don't as a podcaster. But to your point, if you're not a people person, if you're not a social person, just really think about, like, I would just say be present with how you're feeling with that person.
Yeah.
If you're zoning out, chances are other people are going to too. But one of the things I find with big personalities, sometimes they like to take over the conversation. They may not necessarily be narcissistic, but they're used to being the center of attention, so they'll talk for 10, 15 minutes, right? Interrupt them. Be like, hey, sorry, I just want to go back. Sorry to interrupt you. Go back to this. Keep interrupting them. And you're in the driver's seat. And I think people forget that when they're hosting a podcast. When they have a big personality, it's like, no, you're actually driving. They're the passenger in your car. Yeah. So steer it back. Take control of the wheel.
I'm so glad you came to the studio today because like this, I'm already just obsessed with you, number one, but it's like so nice to be on the same wavelength because you're good at your job. Like you've worked in media. You know, there's just a certain vibe that I think someone who's really good at their job, especially being on camera, but also having the business background. Yeah. Is that it? Did you study journalism or what did you?
Yeah. So I studied creative arts at university in Australia. So there was a journalism and media component to it. Okay. So I studied a little bit of that, but I was very shy. So I was like, let's just write. Yeah. Let's not talk. So when I got on radio, I'm like, oh God, I actually have to talk to people. So I was in that place where I'm like, I don't think I'm a people person, but I think I am, but I don't want to talk. Like, but you do, again, when you remember you're in the driver's seat of anything really, you're like, okay, I can drive this car.
How'd you get the radio show?
So the course I did at Joy in Melbourne, they were looking for breakfast hosts. And I think at the time, if I'm going to be completely blunt, you have, brown person, yay, lesbian, yay, woman, yay. It's like, we've got all the diversity boxes here. Let's just pop around. I think I was at the right place at the right time. And I think the training I got the trainers we had at Joy were exceptional. So I think I was very blessed to be able to work with them. And I think at the time the opportunity came up for a morning show. I worked with a couple of people, a couple of teams. And I did various shifts. Like my first shift was a graveyard shift from 1 to 3 a.m. But I loved it. It was fun. And I do it again.
Yeah, that's like TV.
Yeah,
I didn't work in that. I mean, Disney was so different because it was so much more corporate. It was also not live. Was your show live?
Yeah, it was live.
No, mine wasn't. So they would record, like it would be taped and it was a whole process and then it would be edited and come out like weeks after. So it was very similar to podcasting.
Right.
And I think I'm really intrigued by when I was at Disney. They never wanted to go in the podcast space, and I was constantly presenting ideas to them. And don't get me wrong, it was the best experience. I loved everyone there. Yeah. I really appreciated the executives, and I'm so grateful for what they gave me because it came from a cold pitch. Yeah. But they never wanted to almost evolve with the times. Wow. And I think a lot of companies, and especially in the radio space, they don't necessarily, like they should, but they don't know how to. Yeah. So say you're watching this and you're in media, but you're more on the business side, but you're too scared of evolving and then losing the audience that you have. Yeah. Any advice for those businesses?
That's a great question. So I work with a client as well who at a similar, where they've got like set ways of doing things. So to get them to change, like even just to be like, hey, radio's the same thing. We just edit it and pop it on a different app. That's the only difference. I mean, that seems like a very little step if you know podcasting and if you're behind the scenes, but to them it could be like, oh, wow, this is too big, too much. We need to analyze everything. We need to go through every step. Why are we doing this? And it becomes this whole overthought process. But I think for businesses who are looking to kind of move to the new media, like I would say trial it. There's no harm in just being like, it's just one thing. Literally repurposing your podcast is low-hanging fruit. It's not a huge thing. You're not hiring a whole team. It's actually quite limited. You could do it with quite a limited, if at no budget at all. And you can experiment. Let the data speak for itself, really. The data never lies, really.
Yeah, let's talk about the pitch process. So when you come up with sourcing guests, especially the really well-known guests you've had on the show, are they reaching out to you? Did you reach out to them? Are they friends?
Right. So I wish I could say Paula Abdul and I were besties, but sadly we're not. But what happened was, so in radio, we had a team of publicists we worked with. So it would be like networks and that sort of thing. So they would typically pitch primetime breakfast shows, which is what we got. But nowadays, because I'm not on primetime anymore, it's typically relationships with publicists that we have that they're like, hey, this guest is available. They have a show coming out. Will you take them? And I did. So that's kind of how it works. So the pitch process, I would say, begins with, if you don't have that kind of media background, start with building relationships with publicists. Yep. That's the first thing I would say. Like, and you're like, where do I find publicists? I'm like, well, imdb.com. I know Amazon owns it now, but that's a great place to find publicists of certain people. You may not get Hugh Jackman or Ryan Reynolds, but you may get, some guest stars on Apples Never Fall or something like that. Start somewhere, because the more you build your resume with even what seems like an F-list actor or actress, that's building your interview muscle, and secondly, you're building your whole, back catalog of, hey, I can interview these people too. And I think eventually over time, you'll find that if you stick to it, your list of, I guess, clout will get bigger and bigger. So that's the first thing. Start with publicists. And I would also say start getting on other podcasts where you can, like collaborate where you can, because that's also great clout for you as a host. And those podcasts, if you go to matchmaker.fm, that's a great resource. It's free. You can just pitch other podcasts. There are podcasters on there who are looking for guests and vice versa. It's like Tinder for podcasts and podcast guests. Yeah.
I've actually never heard of this. Matchmaker.fm.
.fm, yeah.
Oh, okay. And that's actually really good to know. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I think of this very similar as well to how I think of newsletters.
Yeah.
Because I've been really focused on scaling my newsletter and the collaborative efforts between podcast hosts as well as newsletter creators, whatever, is awesome. And it's a very collaborative space, and it is the best way to get in front of different eyes.
100%.
And it's very different than if you're an influencer or TikToker. Like, you don't really I mean, I guess you can.
Yeah.
But I think that, like, the people who read newsletters,
Yeah.
the people who listen to this podcast and yours, they love you. Like,
Yeah.
they listen to you
Yeah.
every week.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a devoted fan base.
Exactly.
When you started yours, did you have that fan base, or did it take a second?
I think it took a second because I had fans or listeners that transferred over from the radio show, right? But then I was not presenting weather and news and hot topics in my podcast.
Yeah.
I was talking, it was more autobiographical. I was exploring like themes of human connection. And that's what, so it was a different Ginny, right? It wasn't the Ginny that people were used to listening from 6:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. every day. So it was different in that sense. But I think for me, it's like just there are a lot of passive listeners that you have, which I found too, until when someone reached out to me and they go, hey, I want to let you know I listen to you, but you may not get like raving reviews from me, but I do listen to you and I love it. And I'm like, oh, thank you. It's
a compliment.
I think it's a compliment. But again, someone letting me know that they passively listen to me,
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think too, like the sponsorship side of things, because I do a lot of talk about how to cold call and how to cold email and whatnot. So what I find so interesting about podcasting is like really only the host knows the numbers.
Yeah.
And I say this in newsletters and podcasts because I think if you're really scared to put yourself in front of new people, as like on TikTok, on Twitter, where you can go and see 11,000 followers, 100 followers, newsletters and podcasts, you can't. So there is a whole, I think, anonymity, as public as you are, being the writer or the face, where you don't have to feel so much imposter syndrome, like getting sponsorships. Yeah. And I'm not saying that in almost a fake it till you make it, but you can really fake it till you make it in a way that's very different than being so public on Instagram or TikTok, because no one sees those numbers besides you. Yeah. So have you done sponsorships with yours?
I was affiliated with a network who sold the sponsorship for me, so I didn't really have much involvement, but that's a common question I get every day from clients, like, oh, how do we monetize? How do we get sponsorship? So to your point, I think, yes, there is anonymity because the RSS feed, the distribution side, only the host or the producer would know. But the other side of it is when you are pitching, say, a brand or a sponsor, also include your social media clout and the reactions you get to each post, and also the followers of your guests as well. Because that is something that I feel is kind of overlooked. It's like you're only looking at the hardcore numbers of people who listen. But again, back to my passive listener who gave me a backhanded compliment, they could be following your feed, knowing you have a podcast, really, really like you, but they may not have hit play on your show. So it's kind of like, are you buying the podcast or are you buying the person? And sometimes it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
And brands will take, oh, it's a person as well, not just the podcast on its own.
What about reviews? I mean, are those really important?
Reviews are great, one, for credibility. Like if I'm, say, an A-list guest and I'm my PR team scout, it's great for credibility. But where reviews come in handy really are charting positions. So if you have set amount of reviews given to you over a period of time, then you'll chart higher on the Apple Podcast charts. So that's where reviews really, that's why people push reviews, one, for credibility, and secondly, it boosts their ranking.
Okay, so let's go back to what I said, about the guests, because I want to talk about that. And I have now a lot of people who reach out to me asking me to be on their show, and I say no a lot more now than I used to, only because I have, you only have a certain amount of time in the day. Yeah. And at this point, I don't really need to talk to two people on a podcast. Yeah. And I don't say that in a bad way, but like, if you're starting out, I think really find like smaller founders or entrepreneurs who are like really new, maybe they have never been interviewed on a podcast, because I think that's how people who are starting out can get a lot more experience. Yeah. But is there a proper pitch? Like, what would you say? Say you want you on your podcast, or you want like a Cynthia Rowley. Yeah. What do you say? Because I have what I would say to them, but what do you say?
Well, Cynthia Rowley, luckily, we were actually producing a podcast. I'm like, hey, do you want to come on mine? She's like, sure, girl, I'll come on yours. So I already had that relationship, but took me like, we were working with her for like 2-3 years before I
that's so
asked anything. But I think if a pitch would be, again, like, don't be afraid to don't humble brag in your pitch. Like, don't be like, oh, I kind of did this. Like, be like, this is what I've done, this is what I've achieved.
Agreed.
This is what the podcast is about, and this is what the audience will get from you being on the show, and this is what you will get from you being on the show. So it's always good to have, I would say, like a media deck. As kind of old school as that sounds, I find people who come to me with a media deck, I'm like, okay, you're serious.
Yep.
It gives a little edge to them, right? Rather than this long email with links.
Oh my God, I get a lot of those.
Yeah, and also, like, for people who are getting pitched like that every day, that's not going to get my attention. And I would also open up a line with something that connects with them, like the cold pitches you get, like, hey, Alexa.
Loved your episode on.
Yeah, exactly. I really liked when you talked to Ginny about that quote that you had. What was that cool quote you had? If it doesn't have eyes, it doesn't have legs. Like, that was a great... If someone said that to you, like, you'd be like, okay, you got my attention.
I do.
Right?
It's a simple way to...
So make it personal in the first couple of lines, because that's the attention span of people, right? You grab them and then send them a deck.
Yeah. And I also say very fast. I can tell if it's my vibe or not. I mean, I can just tell very fast. I also find a lot of people will pitch me, but they don't include a LinkedIn. I'm really big on LinkedIn. Are you a LinkedIner?
Yeah, I am a LinkedIner.
LinkedIner.
LinkedIn does kind of like, it verifies.
It
you,
does.
Right, it does.
It does. I also appreciate knowing if we have mutual people in common.
Yeah.
So so I think there's a simple way to do the pitch, and I think some of those things you just said there are really great.
Yeah.
As well as media deck, media kit, I would say, because that's kind of what I use.
Yeah.
So what do you see as the future of podcasting?
It's interesting. I get asked this question a lot too. I think there is less, what's the word? Podcasting has always been kind of like a decentralized way of receiving media, right? Like, you've got different apps who do their different things and they have their different data. I think we're heading into the era of Spotify kind of, I guess, gating content. Like, okay, we're only going to put Joe Rogan on Spotify, not on Apple. We're going to put Brene on Spotify, not on Apple. I think we're going to go into an era where that's going to kind of go away, because we want to give the listener or the audience the choice and the autonomy to be like, I want to listen on this app. This is my favorite app. Like, why do I have to buy a subscription? Right. So I think there's more autonomy that's coming. And I'm curious to see the kind of podcasts that come out. I mean, a while ago, Cadence 13, who produced Brene Brown's podcast, was like, oh, we've invested all this money into like doing audio film podcasts, which I'm like, I wonder how that's going to go. I mean, it sounds cool, right? So I'm curious to see the kind of podcasts that are going to come out beyond true crime and beyond business podcasts, right? So I'm curious to see how artistic the category is going to get.
You know what's funny too is, I mean, Quibi. Do you remember Quibi?
No.
Quibi was started by Meg or Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg. You would know, I think, if you looked it up online. Yeah. They put in hundreds of millions to basically get celebrity short form video content. It was like right during COVID. Right. Chrissy Teigen, Shaq, like everyone.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And this was kind of like the first wave, I think, of like the short form content. And it totally bombed. None of the content, I don't think, ever ended up coming out. Yeah. Which is so weird, because you think if you get a Chrissy Teigen or Shaq, whatever, on video, and that all of their fans and stuff are going to listen, and that's not really how it goes. Yeah. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but I mean, I thought Quibi sounded really great, so I was surprised that it didn't work out.
Because it's kind of like TikTokifying podcasts.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I'm not actually familiar with how their platform was. For me, it sounds genius, right? That, you know, you're getting podcasts and you're making sure it sounds genius, but perhaps there was an execution on it that didn't work well, or perhaps people like, we're used to TikTok and they couldn't quite get their heads around it. I don't know what it was, and maybe the timing of the release during 2020 wasn't the best, but I mean, I think short form content, if you can get a podcast and do that, that's genius.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I like being in a studio. To me, this makes my job so much easier, because instead of having to come up with a week of content, this hour is 4 weeks of content.
Exactly.
But you mentioned Cadence.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize the dynamic behind podcasting. So we have like Cadence, we have
Cast
Gimlet,
Media.
we have Dear Media, and a lot of the top shows are on that. Then we have a Spotify and an Apple, which is different. They're not necessarily like as much of a Dear Media is.
Yeah, they're not like necessarily like a boutique production house, but given that Spotify acquired Gimlet, they've got their internal teams. But again, I don't know how they roll, but Sorry, continue your point.
I mean, and it's interesting because a lot of top podcasts obviously are on those networks, and those networks are the ones that bring them advertisers.
Yep.
But I think if you're a smaller show, like what I found is it's very hard to get in front of them unless they're very numbers driven.
Yep.
I mean, I was able to cold email a show to Disney, but I can't get Dear Media even to take a look at me unless I have 30,000 listens. I think they wanted a month or a week. I mean, which is insane.
Yeah.
That's a ton of listens.
Yeah, I'm curious if like their other podcasters get that. And also you mentioned about metrics too, right? So people say downloads, people say listens, and people say, oh, this has had 10 million downloads. It's like, okay, 10 million downloads all time, 10 million downloads monthly per episode. They're leaving, sometimes information is omitted. But I can understand like trying to get to a network, like they have their standards obviously because they want a certain kind of, they want to protect their brand with like their Gabby Bernsteins and everything. And they have Cami Crawford from Catfish as well on Dear Media. So, but someone who's starting out and looking to get sponsorship or anything like that, there are organizations out there like Ossa Collective. They work exclusively with female podcasters and they actually source the sponsor and they pair you up with them. So that's a great resource to have as well.
Is it a rev share or is it upfront money?
I think it's a rev share type situation. I haven't worked with them directly with my show, but Ossa Collective, I've invested in them. They are really, really pioneering women in podcasting because I think the ratio 3 years ago was 36% of women in podcasting compared to men. I know it's grown since then, but they were really passionate about elevating female voices and empowering that.
Have you done personal sponsorships on your show?
On my show, no. I've always been because I was affiliated with a network, I didn't really do that. And now that I'm kind of getting back into it, I'm like, well, I haven't really thought to do it because I love doing it so much. And the artist in me is like, do you want sponsorship for this? Yeah. And I will look at it eventually because I do think it's a matter of time before I'll need to go the route that I take my clients on.
Yeah, and I mean, they definitely, I get the networks because it's the same if you're on the Today Show. And I mean, they're going to be the first to boot someone or one show if there's not enough because it's the advertisers at this point that keep a lot of this media going. Yeah. I will say, I don't do affiliate links. And I think a lot of creators, podcasters, they do because personally to me, it's not worth it to promote this cup. Yeah. To get I'd have to sell 1,000 of this, right, for 15 cents that they'll give you per cup. So no, it's just a waste of my time. So I personally, as a entrepreneur, cash up front for these deals. Yeah. Because that's what pays my bills. I can't guarantee. I don't like the possibility that this cup is going to pay my rent next month. Yeah. Whereas
you want some assurance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why.
Absolutely.
But I think a lot of these brands use the affiliate and the rev share deals, and a lot of these creators or influencers are like, oh my God, yeah, because I'm getting a partnership. And I'm like, honey, you're just getting 15 cents off the cup or potential bag. But sure, if it makes you feel cool. Yeah. But what would you say is the first step for a newer podcaster to get in front of brands?
I would say look at the quality of your content. Yeah. It's always hard to do something, this is going to sound very cliche, but it's when you do the difficult thing first, it becomes easier down the track. When you do the easier thing first, it becomes difficult down the track, right? Imagine having to try to figure out, how do I edit? How do I get this thing done? If you can, either take the time to edit or hire a team to do it, because the quality of your content is what brands want to align with. And if it is presented in a professional way, they're more likely to be like, okay, she's got that part sorted or they've got that part sorted. Yeah. We just need to put our ad in that. It also gives you that, I guess, that leverage to be like, well, I'm taking this seriously. I'm not just doing this for the sake of doing it. So I think start there. And I think the next thing is, once you've got that, think about, okay, how much does it cost to run this thing? How much do I need this thing to make for me to be comfortable? And I would say also, even if you have to present in a serial format, don't go the whole episodic of hey, I need 100K a year. If you okay, for a 12 episode series, this is how much it's going to cost. Think about it like that, chunk it down. I think start small. As I said before, I've worked with companies who do 3 episode deals. Start small and then you'll once you build your network of brands and who you're affiliated with, they'll come.
And I think people underestimate how really easy it is. I mean, look, if you go to Whole Foods and I used to do this when I was starting out, Sally Beauty Supply Store in Whole Foods. You take photos of all the brands on those shelves.
Yeah.
Every company has $50.
Yeah.
Every company like knows as well that $50, $100, $150, if they lose it, at least it's brand awareness, right? So I think when you're going through the process of doing a proper pitch, know that if you can find 10 brands for $50, oh my God, am I this bad at math? Help me out. $500.
$500. Yeah.
500. Okay, I did it. I was like, oh my gosh. It's $500 in your pocket right there, but it takes time. And so that's why that's the thing with podcasting is like, it's a process, right? And it takes a long time and it's a long game. And I think you have to be in it for the reasons that you and I are in it, which is like, you love the experience of sharing someone's story.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's see. Anything else they should
think about?
I feel like I've asked you such intense questions.
No, I love it. I think they're really important questions too. But honestly, I would think like start professional. Even if you get like $100 mic, you don't have to, buy a $400 one. $100 USB mic, like just start doing that. Like when you start to take that part of your passion seriously or the podcast seriously, you just show up different because you're like, all right, I've already put money towards it. I need to commit to this.
Yeah, there's one that I like, which is the first one I had, the Blue Yeti mic. I mean, I think it's like 75, 150. Yeah. And also, again, like we said at the beginning, not posting because you're expecting to get eyes, posting because you're sharing someone's story, you're properly editing it. I mean, that's really worth it. You can also find editors super cheap on like Fiverr and Upwork and stuff.
Absolutely.
Which kind of make it a bit of an easier process.
Yeah, absolutely. Upwork is where I started too with editors. And it is, you can find people for a relatively cheap price to do it for you. Cost effective as well.
I'm going to link in the show notes that Matchmaker as well as some of the other, these networks that you mentioned. Should podcasters have that as their goal to get on a network?
Not necessarily. I think some people prefer that because it kind of gives that sense of security. And I think for me, it was just a natural progression from I already was on a network. I'm going solo. It kind of felt like familiar territory for me. But if you want to remain independent and go to brands directly, you can still do that. Networks may not be, I mean, it sounds good because you have a group of shows and a built-in audience to go to, but it may not be the right path for you. And that's what part of the figuring out process is.
Yeah, and it's also, if you have 30,000 downloads or listens, like then you should be with a network. Yeah. If I had it, like that's what I would want, right? But I think if you're a bit smaller than that, or you're independent, or you also really like the process of doing things on your own, then no, it's not. It's
exactly. Exactly.
So, Ginny, you're amazing. Where can everyone find you on social media?
You can find me at The Ginny Show or at Ginny Media. But The Ginny Show is my personal one. So that's the one I check and post my crazy things on. Ginny Media is a little bit more buttoned up.
Thank you so much
Thank you, Alexa. This was so much fun.
And for everyone who wants to learn more about Ginny or more advice, connect with her on LinkedIn. I will put everything in the show notes. And I will see you all next week for a new episode.